the diffuse version of that, we have words for that, paranoia and irritability. So what it does is it makes the whole society a little more paranoid and irritable. Not grossly more, a little more, but it does it on an ongoing basis. So there's a bit of a cumulative effect. So what I saw, for instance, I was in Brazil during the Bolsonaro election. And Bolsonaro is really a shit. I'm sorry, I don't know what, I'm sort of using dirty words. I don't know what you're planning to do with the video. But Brazil is such a wonderful country. It's just so incredible. And so you talk to people and you say, why are you voting for this guy? I'm just pissed off and I just don't know these other people. There were all these weird, paranoid rumors going around. I can't even reproduce them, but the same kind of stupid things that are going around the internet now or went around about it, Hillary Clinton or, it's like this. These weird, almost like infantile fantasy paranoid things. It's just the strangest thing. If you want to get a good taste of these, well, just use your social media. But a good one is to let YouTube recommend videos to you. You can either start YouTube totally fresh, where there's it can't tell who the user is, and just let it recommend, or start from anything and let it recommend. And usually, not always, but in the majority of cases when I've done tests with hundreds of people. After maybe close to 20, sometime between 15 and 20, you'll end up in the world of these really bizarre, infantile, paranoid videos about the world and public figures that just seem to be designed to separate people from reality and make people distrust. And the reason why is that that's a video that's optimized to stimulate the fight or flight response that creates the strong signal that the algorithm is capable of seeing at all. Now, the horrible thing about this is that people are actually not that bad. If you have a chance for people to interact with the world on some basis other than having their strong signal fight or flight responses detected, they actually respond equally well to positivity. But the algorithm can't detect that, so it doesn't happen. So I told you that there were going to be two effects I described, one psychological and the other economic. So now let me describe the economic one. If you talk to have any of you interned at a tech company, or which one?
Splunk.
What?
Splunk.
Cisco. Any others? What? Facebook. Okay. All right. By the end of this talk, you might be burying your head in a wet towel and crying. But anyway. No, I have a lot of friends at Facebook, and they're nice people and all that, of course. And a lot of my ex-students have gone to Facebook and all blah blah blah. But anyway, it's still an evil business plan. If you talk to people in tech companies about their self-perception, they'll say, "Oh, this whole advertising thing is just a temporary gig. What we really are is AI companies. We're getting everybody's data because we're building better and better AIs." And particularly at Google, they'll say that, but they'll say that at Facebook too. And they'll say something similar at Amazon and all that. We're all and I'm at Microsoft these days, and we all are talking about this AI race. So the AI race is to work out algorithms that can take data from the world and then use that data to create programs or robots with actuators that can accomplish something. I find it fascinating. I love it. I sold Google their first machine vision capability, which was their first face recognizer, which was it's a whole interesting story I can tell you about. It was originally used as a comic effect in a jazz band in New York City, where the face of the musician would turn into different weird things in the way that a snap filter would these days. And then it was used to prototype the devices we used as scene ideas for Minority Report, like where the guy gets grabbed into an advertisement. That was a real thing I built back in the 90s. Anyway, sold the thing to Google. And I want you to consider what's going on here in a totally different light. You know how sometimes you can look at things and you can see them with a figure ground inversion and see exactly the same thing but with a different interpretation? Like you can look at people as just the intermediate stages between genes and you get this totally different picture, often which is taken too far in my opinion, but it's just, so I'm going to ask you to do that but with AI. And this is going to be uncomfortable if you really like AI or if you're like getting a degree in it or something, but just bear with me, okay? And to give you this sensibility, I'm going to use a particular example, which is people who translate between languages. So my mentor, Marvin Minsky, one of the founders of the AI field, in the late 50s assigned some graduate students a summer project of achieving machine language, with the idea that you get the 2 dictionaries for the languages and some grammar mapping and it should just work. And of course that doesn't work. And people famously tried to do that for decades. And then finally in the 90s, some researchers at IBM came up with the idea of big data, of finding a ton of phrase translations from a body of work that was already translated, correlating them, mashing them up with a few rules, and suddenly, for the very first time, you got usable translations. And we've been refining that ever since. So you might say to yourself, well, that's great. As soon as you've input that initial body of text from which to mine the phrase translations, then you're done. Then you have a language translator forever. And so then the poor people who used to make a living translating have to just accept that they're obsolete, because you have this big electronic brain that is replacing what the human translator used to do. But that point of view isn't exactly accurate, and the reason why is that language is alive. Every single day brings with it news, tweets, memes, pop culture. In order to talk, you have to use current language, right? If I talk about, Jerry Yang, I hadn't heard of him a few months ago, and now he's like this guy talking about internet stuff, running for president. Like, these things move really fast. That's his name, right? Is
Andrew.
it Jerry?
Andrew.
Andrew. See, I don't even have it in my head yet, so it's still pretty new to me. And although I've noticed him quoting me, and he gets my names, and I feel really like a jerk. But anyway, but I'm bad at learning names. Anyway, the thing is, the way that the systems actually work, and we have one at Microsoft, Google has one, the Chinese companies have them, there's only a few places that really do this at scale, is every single night we go through and we scrape the internet for tens of millions of fresh example phrases that are translated from people who don't know that we're stealing from them. So, for instance, we've identified on social media that people have family members who speak different languages who routinely do translations. We've identified informal volunteer clubs who caption movies and TV for their own language groups. People like that. There are tens of millions of them. We steal from them every single day. We incorporate them to update our model, and then we say, here's our electronic brain that translates automatically. Meanwhile, what's happened to the people who translate for a living? The people who translate for a living have seen the careers available to them fall to between a 10th and a 100th, depending on the country and how much government support they get. In the US, it's like to 100th. Because if you were going to be a professional translator, your mainstay used to be translating memos and stuff, which there's not a market for. Now, the economics of how these people lose their livelihoods is complex. It's not a universal dampening down. Instead, there's a small minority that actually does better than they would have before. You take what used to be a bell curve and turn it into a zip curve, and the economics is really interesting. But for the vast majority of people, their jobs went away. So we're telling them, you're a buggy whip. Do you know that reference? Have you heard of the buggy whip? Oh, okay, it's a metaphor. In economics, there's an idea called creative destruction, which is that when innovation comes along, some people lose their old livelihoods because technologies change. They have to retrain for something else, and it's very sad, but it's inevitable. So there used to be a huge industry of buggy whips, where these whips that made horses move around before there were cars. The internal combustion engine comes along. People don't like the horse poop, so they move to the car, and suddenly this whole buggy whip industry goes away. The buggy whip industry was centered in Rochester, New York, and so Rochester reformulated itself as the camera city, where Kodak and Polaroid were, that made the analog cameras, the chemical cameras. Then Instagram happened, and now Rochester is not doing as well. But that's another story. Actually, it's the same story. It's exactly the same story. So, we're telling these people, your buggy whips, your skills are obsolete, sorry, creative destruction happened, we have this giant electronic brain that can do what you used to do, except it turns out that the people we're stealing phrase translations to overlap very strongly with the people who used to make a living at it. So essentially, we're still using their skills, we're just not paying them for it, in order to create the illusion that we have a freestanding translation machine. Do you see what's going on here? So in my view, there are many reasons this is really stupid. One reason is that it's just evil. To tell somebody you're worthless when they're still needed feels like some sort of spiritual crime to me. It feels like the kind of degrading thing a bully says. Why are you doing that?
Oh, 2 minutes.
Forget it, it's not going to happen. I don't know. Well, I'm just going to keep going here. You can jump on my mouth. I don't know what to do about this. What are you going to do with the speaker? Anyway, I'm going to go on here. So, I'm sorry. This is terrible.
We have a moderated portion where one of our
I know the whole deal. All right, I'll try to wrap this up. So, so one way it's stupid is it's just wrong to tell people they're worthless when they're not. Another way is in order to keep up this illusion that AI is a freestanding thing, we're not allowed to just tell the people what phrase translations we actually need. So there's this giant, like, bizarre hide-and-seek thing, like, well, maybe they'll give us the phrases we need. Let's just try to steal for more and more of them until we can get them. But it's so stupid. What if we could just talk to them and say, hey, this is what we need today, and pay them, for God's sakes, it would be fair. And then there are a bunch of other, I won't go through all the reasons it's stupid, but basically it makes the software worse. And the only reason we do it that way is for the myth of AI, is to be able to think of the computer as a freestanding thing. If we thought of the computer as a channel by which people offer data of use to each other, then we would lose the idea that the computer is coming alive. What we would gain is a lot of human dignity and a better economic outcome and a larger economy, because right now we hide the data value of the economy. The only part that we acknowledge on the books is its use to the advertising model. So we're artificially suppressing our economy on the books, which has tremendous downsides. And particularly at this historical moment, that's an interesting macroeconomic argument that I don't have time to do. So for all these reasons, finally I want to put the solution in 1 minute is people should be paid for their data, they should own it. Remember I was originally talking about how people have to form into groups. They should form into groups. We call these MIDs, mediators of individual data. A MID serves a bunch of functions, and there are already prototype MIDs forming all over the world, already thousands of them actually. A MID is a quality control thing where you kind of form a brand with the other people who are in your MID, so you don't want each other to turn into Nazis. You have to kind of uphold your brand because you're sinking or rising together. MIDs collectively bargain like labor unions, so the price of data doesn't go to zero. MIDs create intergenerational continuity, like institutions like Berkeley or the New York Times or whatever. They serve a crucial function. They serve the same function of coarse graining that species do in evolution, where you can have a complexity instead of just little units that competes in a larger system. So they're like species in evolution, or like layers in neural nets. You can't just have this giant scattering of little things. They also create civility because it's not an each against each society. So many other things. But anyway, you need to get paid for your data. Some people mistake that as a sort of an extreme idea that you must always sell all your data. Not so. And in fact, you have more choices than you do now, where you're just being ripped off all the time and you have no idea what's going on. But there's a flip side to that, which is you start to pay for things, but overall you'd do better. Overall you'd be richer than you are now. But you, just as you might pay for Netflix now, you'd start to pay for stuff like search and social networking, but it would get better instead of be such a pile of crap. All right, that's the talk. Now, I'm a musician too, and I often bring an exotic instrument to play. What I suggest is let's do a little bit of the moderated thing, and then right at the end I'll play some music on an ancient instrument from Laos. How about that? Yeah. All right. Great.
I'd now like to welcome up our student moderator, Omatara Aloye.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, sure.
Appreciate your talk. We're really excited to have you. So to start off, I'm going to start with something that you didn't really get a chance to talk about in your talk. In the past, you've identified profit maximization as a problem with Silicon Valley culture. In the context of the industry's rapid growth and innovation, what can be done to balance the needs to create incentives for growth, but also balance it with the need for corporate responsibility?
Yeah, so I really like the word balance. So one of the things that I've really come to believe is there's no such thing as a perfect system for people. And so what that and this is a hard concept because as you go around in life, you will meet people who are absolutely sure that whatever system they're interested in, if we would just get rid of all the other human systems, it would be perfect. So like, if all we had were markets and we had a perfect libertarian system, then all our problems would go away. Or if all we had was some kind of democratic socialist system with voting, then everything would be fixed. Every single one of those has had horrible historical failures. There's not a single system that's perfect, nor should we expect there to be one. And I think for solid mathematical reasons, I don't think it's possible to do it. And so we have to think of these things as balancing each other. We have to, so if you have, the good thing about capitalism, if it's balanced, is it actually can be an agent of decentralization. Now the crony capitalism that we're veering into it to a rather alarming degree centralizes wealth to a crazy degree. And here I can, there are a great many very good critics today. Piketty wrote a good book about this, and you can find many sources on this. So we have too great a wealth divide, we have too much concentration, in my view. But in principle, see, the thing that happens is if you have social structures that are, let's say, political structures, no matter how well intended they are, they tend to get captured over time and become themselves centralized bad structures. And so a good example of this is the history of communism in Russia, where you started out with the Bolsheviks, and whatever you think of them, and there's quite a range of legitimate opinions about them, the Stalinists were definitely worse. And whenever you start with Bolsheviks, eventually you get Stalinists. And so this is one of the reasons I like the idea of having democratic systems and market systems simultaneously, as awkward as the fit is that they can kind of balance each other. They can prevent either one from becoming powerful enough that it creates this super tempting target for the worst people to take over. Because whenever you have a concentrated thing, it's like a magnet for these creepy people. And it's like been true throughout history. So, I think achieving decentralization has to involve multiple systems that awkwardly fit together, and has to kind of just make the whole thing too complicated to take over. So I kind of like a messy world. So right now, with tech companies, we tend to have these network monopolies. I remember with Al Gore, when we were starting the internet way back, I remember this meeting where he said, you know, we're doing the internet as this bare bones thing. It doesn't have any way of representing people. It didn't come with accounts. It doesn't have any way, it has no memory. It doesn't know where any data came from. It doesn't have any transactions in it. It doesn't have any dating system in it. I don't mean like Tinder. I mean like, you know, what date something was put in place. And it doesn't, like, it's a very bare bones, send a bit from here to there. And so we're creating future trillion-dollar monopolies for persons unknown to fill in these holes. And so the issue of where something came from was more or less taken by Google, and the account was taken by Facebook. Like, all of the big holes we knew about turned into major tech monopolies later on. So a digital network intrinsically does give rise to monopolistic super hubs. I think the way to balance, see, this gets back to why I think you should be paid for data. If you have to pay for the data that's going into the hub, then you distribute the power of the hub to the people the data comes from. If the translators are being paid for their data, then they would be able to strike and so forth. They would have the power of labor, and there would not be all power and all decision to the hub. Does that make sense? Alright, cool.
You talked about decentralization and micro-lending in your talk, which leads us to technologies such as blockchain. What do you think the role of decentralized technologies could have in larger conversations around the digital field?
Yeah, the decentralization community is one of the most vibrant and interesting ones in the digital world now, and I really like them. And blockchain in particular, I think, is a step on the way. There are a couple of things really wrong with blockchain. One thing about it is it uses deliberate inefficiency as its mechanism, and so therefore it'll have an ever-rising carbon footprint. And unless you come up with some way to put all the servers on the moon or something, it's really not acceptable at the scale it would have to get to run everything. So there has to be something that's lighter than blockchain. But I think that might actually be better too, and I'll tell you why. blockchain is like this really solid, secure system for decentralization. But the thing is, whenever you have like a super secure layer, there's this thing that always happens, which is right at the edge of the layer, there's this cliff, where there's suddenly you're in this world of no security, and then there are all these goblins and demons at the bottom of that cliff. So with like, Bitcoin's a great example. You can have exchanges for Bitcoin. The Bitcoin system itself is really robust, but the exchanges are often fraudulent or terribly run, and people forget their code, so they lose their Bitcoins, and people steal them all the time. And so the better way to do a protocol for decentralization is with a gradual fall off of security rather than this perfect thing and then a cliff. And so if you combine those two things, then you can get a much smaller carbon footprint with a gradual thing. So there's some kind of lighter, softer thing than blockchain that'll be better than blockchain, in my opinion.
And in your talk, you also spoke about social messaging apps and the connectivity between two people. Some social messaging apps, such as WeChat and WhatsApp, have enabled people across the globe to stay connected with family members and friends without an upfront cost. How, if at all, would you balance your opinion of social media with some of its perceived positive externalities?
So, I would never deny the positive effects of social media. It's just a statistical distribution. So, for instance, Brazil is all about WhatsApp. And I think social media has brought a lot of real benefits. My favorite benefit is people with unusual diseases can find each other, and it used to be that they couldn't. And that's like a very dramatic improvement for a lot of people's lives. So I'd never in a minute deny any of that positivity. But I think the right question to ask is people would say, well, but wait a second, under your proposal where things are more monetized, would that exclude people from that benefit? And that's a really important economic question. So every time I've looked into this with a variety of different researchers using very different methodologies, we've come to the conclusion that actually people, particularly in the developing world, would make money from this rather than lose money from this transition. And I can give you many examples of how this would work, but I can mention two. I don't know if this might take a long time, but in the developing world in particular, there's massive data theft. And a lot of our culture in the rich world is just taken from the poor world without acknowledgement. And if we started to have an accountable system, a lot of the culture industry would be transferring wealth around the world much more equitably. That's one example, but there's another example that's very concrete. That might sound like very distant and futuristic. You might not believe me, although if I had more time I could argue it, and I think I could convince you of that. And I can convince you that that's actually important and that the culture sector will become larger and larger the better the robots get. But leaving that aside, you see, if people are paid for data, then the more robots there are, the more careers there are, people providing them with data. If people aren't paid for data, then the more robots there are, then the fewer jobs there are, because then the people are treated as valueless. So it's like this issue of whether people's data is valued totally determines the future of employment when the robots get better. But there's a present day, I'm trying to talk fast because you have a little time. Microsoft has this video chat thing called Skype, and we did some research on people in the developing world using Skype, and what we found is that there are tens of millions of people, and it's hard to get to a number, but it's almost certainly hundreds of millions, who cobble together these ways of making a living by offering value over Skype. And the range of things are legal advice, religious instruction, language instruction, tax advice, all kinds of things like that. And we totally excluding the sex work thing, which is morally complex, and so I just want to just chop it off and not even treat it as part of the discussion for now. But of those people, there are people who, without any help from a tech company, have to cobble together services from like 5 tech companies to be able to work out their schedule and the payment and everything. And they figured out a way to use the internet to start making a living that they weren't before. And to me, that's like a great use of the internet. Like that, and this idea that no, the best thing about the internet is not having to pay for it. If you could get paid more than what you're putting in, because it's making the world better and the value of the world is increasing, so accurate accounting actually raises everybody, isn't that a better outcome? And I think that that's the truth. The truth is, in response to the question, isn't there positivity? Yes, there is positivity, it's very real, and if we allow ourselves to acknowledge it, we can all do better. But by pretending it has no monetary value, we're actually holding everybody in economic place, so it actually hurts the poor more. So this initial intuition that if you had to pay for Facebook it would hurt the poor more, I think is actually the opposite of what would happen. Does that make sense? Is that too fast?
No.
Okay, great.
Unfortunately, for the sake of time, this will be my last question before we open up questions to the audience, and then we continue play.
Okay, sure.
You've previously mentioned your desire for computer science to take a more human-centered approach rather than a machine supremacy approach. What does it mean to center humans in technology, and how should the industry change in order to prioritize this approach?
Okay, yeah, so part of this has to do with the philosophy of what information is. So the way I used to express this, which is still about as good as I've ever come up, this goes back almost 40 years, it's kind of depressing, but anyway, 40 years ago I came up with the phrase, information is alienated experience, which is to say that if you put a bit in a computer, it's not meaningful until somebody comes along with the cultural context to be able to decode the bit and find experience out of it. And so if you recognize that the only value in computers is human experience, and I mean that with great rigor, that there's nothing of value in a computer other than the human experiences that can come out of interacting with it. If you think of it that way, if you think of it purely as an experience machine, which is an absolutely consistent and complete way to think about computation, and you cease to think about the computer as accomplishing anything outside of human experience, then you force yourself to think in terms of how usable the computer is, how sensible it is, and all that kind of stuff. And it just, people who think that way make better programs. They make more usable programs. And I've really found consistently that this philosophical approach, when it's held by people who design a software system, it creates a system that's more used and more valuably used.
Thank you for answering all of my questions.
Okay.
We are now moving on to audience questions. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Mr. Lanier, please raise your hand and I will call on you. Please keep your questions brief, and please remember to speak up.
Do you want to choose? Would you?
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here today. I am curious about what you're most concerned about in current development in the world. I think recently there's been a number of writers who have articulated kind of like dystopic nightmare scenarios of where we're going in the future as biotech and medical develop. And you've articulated some concerns now. I'm curious specifically, what are your biggest concerns today with developments of tech, and what is your nightmare scenario?
Well, I mean, a lot of the nightmare scenarios are sort of, I could say the easy, obvious ones, like swarms of murder drones that are looking for people of a certain ethnicity or something like that. You could imagine these, you could imagine Turkey having gotten 1 million photos of Kurds, training a system on it, and then just unleashing 10,000 drones and killing all the Kurds or something like that. That would appear to be a plausible technology that wouldn't work perfectly, but would sort of work at least. And that's a very common dystopian kind of scenario. You see a lot of those. But there's another kind that's equally disturbing to me, actually, even if it wouldn't murder people instantly, which is where you say, well, do you remember I used the example of language translators and how you keep on needing more text coming in? Where they would say, well, no, you don't really need that. We'll just get the AI to use whatever text it has, and then people will do that. And then the AI can generate new text or something. In other words, to put people on human culture under control of the algorithm rather than having the algorithm responding to new data coming in. And this is where people become really lessened. If you look inside the plans of a lot of the tech companies, this is actually an incredibly common scenario. Like, I think it's pretty hard to find an arms manufacturer who's saying we're going to make swarms of machine vision killer drones that seek people of a certain type. It might be happening in places in the world. I have a feeling, well, it's very easy to imagine somebody doing that in China or something. I mean, I can imagine these things exist. But the people doing it must at least have qualms. But the people who are talking about just automating culture and turning people into drones under control, following Skinner's original vision, just think it's great. You know, I mean, it's like there's this weird self-consciousness, and that terrifies me. And I see it again and again. And if you just go to like a startup gathering or something, there's a zillion people thinking that way. And I'm really scared of that, because since people don't see that it's so creepy and horrible, I'm afraid it might actually happen. Because there's not even an articulation of why you should have a conscience about that problem. And so that's the one that scares me even more than the various other. And I only gave you the killer drone one. Of course, there's a zillion other things like that. But that's a good dramatic one, I guess. And it has a feeling of karma about it since we've used drones so much and all that.
Hi, thank you so much. So you come at this issue from a tech background, but have clearly studied a lot of economics and psychology, political theory even. And I'm curious, like, how you went about that process and what advice you have for people who stand on the other side, such as myself from social science, humanities background, who want to learn more and like actually develop some expertise.
I initially thought that economics was the most boring thing in the world. I thought, why would you do economics? It's like this tweedly, nerdy. I like that. That's what I originally thought. And it's like I was like, and you know, you become interested in things out of necessity. And if you follow the path you're on, you will be forced to learn other things because they're all connected. It does take a while. And another thing is that the people in whatever field it is that you might be entering are going to think you're an outsider and like, who's this person entering, like what do they know about whatever the thing is, you know, and you'll have to deal with a lot of attitude, and it's hard. And another thing is that a lot of times each field of inquiry builds up its own culture, has its own journals and its own major figures and its own language and everything. And a lot of times there's a little bit of cultiness to it. And when you come to it fresh, you can see the parts of that that are silly. And every single field has that. And then you have to sort of pretend to not see it in order to interact with the people. So it's a whole interesting journey.
Thank you for giving the talk. It's really insightful. So I come from like a VR background, and I'm curious to see, given your expertise in VR as well as all of the things that you've experienced, how VR can play into this idea of, you know, what the future of the internet and things like this are going to be.
Oh my God. That's a huge topic. Are you with Oculus or?
So I'm at XR at Berkeley, which is a club on campus here. So some of us are.
Oh, weren't you you did a Facebook thing though, right?
I was part of like Oculus Launchpad. I don't know if you know.
Okay, cool. This is too big a topic to do in a short answer, but a couple things to say are, part of why I'm making such a fuss now about the things that I am is that we have to get this stuff right before digital technology gets much more intense. So if in the future we're all, like VR can make a much stronger Skinner box than your stupid little smartphone or smart speaker, right? And if any of the brain interface starts to work better, that could be also even more strong, perhaps. Who knows? We don't know where that'll go. So we have to get this stuff right with the relatively pale and insignificant technologies that are currently commonplace, because it's going to get so much more intense. So that's one thing to say. The other thing to say is that, at least for me, VR embodies this alternate philosophy I'm talking about. Like, for instance, when you're interacting with your smartphone, it's kind of always sending you the message that you're just a computer, because it talks to you as if it's your peer. It's like this other creature, and it creates this sense of equivalence between you and it to some degree. Even if you don't buy it, you're living it all the time. You're talking to the agent, and it's making decisions for you. You're giving over something to it. So there's this kind of weird peer thing instead of it being just a subordinate machine. AI gives this other feeling, at least to me, like let's say you're in a virtual world. You can change the world. Obviously, that's the whole point. You can also change your body dramatically. You can turn into a spindly dragon or whatever. You can change the way a lot of things work. You can change the sense of the passage of time. You can change physics. You can change all this stuff. And when you have everything variable, what's the continuity that holds it together? Well, there's this little point floating in there. That's your consciousness. So it highlights that you're a real thing, that you're different from all that other stuff. You're this thing that continues through all those changes. And so VR tends to highlight some kind of mystical or magical specialness in people that tends to be suppressed by the smartphone and many other designs. And so in that sense, maybe it'll be part of the solution.
I think we have time for one more audience question.
So thank you very much for your talk. I would like to go back to what you were mentioning about property rights and data. because there is a massive debate at the moment in legal circles in general, and in particular at this law school, saying that essentially if you start to create property rights in data, you have terrible privacy issues with that. So for example, if all my data would be sold to, say, Facebook or whatever, then I don't have any more rights to it. It's as if you sell a house and you can just live in it.
I'm aware of the debate you're talking about, and I just kind of want to slap these people because it's so ridiculous. Of course you wouldn't sell your data. That would be a terrible thing. You should have moral rights to your data. The MID licenses it. You have moral rights to your data, and you have personal rights to what you do with your data. So for instance, each person in a MID has to be able to set their own price, their own terms, their own policy. If you want to say, yeah, you can have my data, it's $1 billion a bit, that's your right. But you're never allowed to sell your data in the scheme I'm talking about. You have a moral right to your data in the same sense that artists have moral rights. You can license it, you can get, the vision we have is that you'd start to get royalties over time and dividends, but it's very, very important to point out that you would never actually sell it. And furthermore, there's another bit of math that's extremely important. Maximum sharing of your data doesn't maximize your income in the world I'm talking about. And this might sound counterintuitive, but this has to do with the mathematics of economics, which for some reason a lot of lawyers refuse to consider. So there's actually going to be some lack of sharing that will make your data a little rarer, that will make it more expensive, that would maximize, if you believe that people are going to act purely on maximizing their income, which I don't think is true. It's never true in any economy. It's only certain assholes who do that. Almost normal people don't. Normal people are more moderate. But even if you believe that every single person is going to be driven to do nothing but maximize their profit, that would not be total sharing. It actually would be less sharing than is shared today. It's at a different point. So I think that one of the problems that the lawyers jump to the thing that they can criticize the most, even though it's absurd and nobody's asked for it. And the second thing is that they don't consider macroeconomic principles that would lead to intermediate results rather than the extreme results that they might think of in a sort of a cartoon world. So I am aware of this debate. Its foundations are just bizarre to me. Like, they just don't make any sense. But you're correct, there's a massive debate. In Berkeley, it's particularly strong. Interestingly, in this case, in Europe, the debate is more interesting and subtle, for the most part, than it is in the US. I think it's because they're a little farther along. They've gone through regulating privacy with GDPR, which I was also involved in, that's a whole long story, and it hasn't worked out very well. So they've already gone through another stage that we haven't, and so they've achieved a bit more sophistication. But yeah, you're absolutely correct, it's going on. I don't know why, but it is.
Well, that's all the time we have for our audience portion. Thank you again for answering all of our questions.
Can I hear some music?
Yeah, if you want to pull out your instrument while I call our president, Tanya Mahadwar, for some remarks.
So give a round of applause. We always give our speaker a custom poster.
That's so nice.
Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your evenings to come to this event.
He's got hands and a graph.
We have another event on the 21st with Rebecca Saltzman, who is the Vice President of BART. In addition, if you can take the time to fill out our feedback form.
Will see me on time?
If BART runs on time. And so if you all could please take the time to fill out tinyurl.com/Berkeley forum feedback, that would be really helpful as we try to optimize our events. We do have to leave this room at 7:30, but we will start cleaning up.
What time is it?
7:12.
It's 7:12.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm just going to play this like really fast.